Thank you for coming. Today we're going to learn how to bridge the culture gap. With us is Mala Subramaniam. Mala is a multicultural communications expert. She has over 20 years in corporate America working at companies like IBM, Dun & Bradstreet, Blue Cross in a variety of leadership roles. She has also recently trained over 3,000 IT professionals and their corporate clients, and has taught them about leadership and how to work effectively together. Let's learn about bridging the cultural gap. Welcome, Mala.
Thank you very much. That was a great introduction, and I am delighted to be addressing this group. And thank you so much for pronouncing my name accurately. I have been called Submarine, and you did a great job of pronouncing it Subramaniam. I just want to give you an illustration of what happens when there is a gap in communications. I'm going to take you back a few years when I started right after I completed my MBA. I was in this job in a bank, a project manager for market research. Frank was my boss. About 3 months down the road, Frank called me and he said, "Mala, can you attend this meeting? It's a project update meeting. I would love for you to accompany me." So I was all excited, took my notepad, went to the meeting, and I sat there with a room full of people. There were at least about 10 to 12 people, and firing questions at Frank and sometimes looking at me. And every time they looked at me and asked a question or addressed a concern, I would say yes, yes. And we finished the meeting, came back. A week later, Frank called me and he said, "Mala, are you ready with the projects?" I said, "What projects?" "Oh, the projects that you said yes to that day." And I said, "Oh my God, Frank, when I said yes, I meant yes, I understood. Because in India, we have a habit of saying yes, yes, yes. And yes meant I understood." So that was the first lesson Frank and I learned, that we have to look beyond the visible characteristics of a person. You see, there is a visible and an invisible layer in communications. What is visible is the language, the way we talk, the way we walk, and the way we gesture, address each other, and even some of the attitudes that we display. But all that is driven by where you were raised, how you were raised. So it's the culture, the community, and even your own individual attributes. Just imagine a tree. When you look at a tree, you're seeing the branches, you're seeing the leaves, you're seeing the fruits or the flowers. But what you're not seeing is the roots or the original source of the tree, the little cell or the little seed that carries all the traits and everything. So when you look at a tree, you're not going to be able to know whether it's going to turn color in winter. So it is so important to understand the people behind their behavior in order to close the gap. And that's what I teach. This is a passion for me. You know, there are several sociologists like Hall and Hofstede who have propounded theories, tremendous theories, you know, called the high context, the low context, and the 5 dimensions of cultural communications. In my 20 years that I've been interacting with people in business situations or in personal situations, there are 4 dimensions that I look at. One is language, the other is time, the third is influence, and the fourth is structure. We already addressed the language part of it. Time is, different countries have different perspectives on time. And when you, for instance, say 9 o'clock, 9 o'clock here means something different, the promptness, the timeliness. There is a time value for money. And in other countries, that may not be the case. And also influence. What influences people's behavior? In some countries, the older people influence the behavior, or the boss, or somebody in authority. So it's the power influence. And finally, structure. And some people from certain countries can really thrive on uncertainty. But here in this country, we like the structure because everything is laid out for us. So those are the 4 building blocks to culture. And, I can give an example of time. I remember, a few of us colleagues were walking past the lunchroom, the cafeteria, and we saw a few people from other countries who were sitting together and having lunch very quietly. There was no talking, nothing. And one of my colleagues said, "Can you believe that? They're so unsocial. They're not even talking to each other." And can you imagine them taking a full lunch hour? And I looked at her and I said, "Do you know that in some countries, talking while eating is sacrilegious because eating is very sacred. So you're really not supposed to do any activity when you are eating, so you don't multitask." In the same manner, we look at some people here. They have a cell phone in their hands, a sandwich in the left hand, and a computer in front of them, and a few people waiting to talk to them, multitasking. And we think, oh, crazy people. And they're really not crazy. That's the way they were raised. There's a time value for money. So you really have to understand the differences.
Mala, can you give us an example of how influence affects communications?
Sure. That is a great question because power influences behavior. In some countries like Japan, in India, people never talk back to their elders. In fact, in business meetings, if there are superiors in the meeting, you will not see them even talk or address a question or even, raise any concerns. And this comes from the way we are raised.
Mala, in the context of culture, what does structure and time mean?
In some countries, they thrive on uncertainty. And here in America, everything is very structured. We have contracts, we have rules. Just simply driving on the road, you will see that people, you have rules, you can see the lines on the roads, you have the stoplight, the signal light. You don't see anything other than vehicles on major highways and on local highways other than pedestrians and who, walk when there is a green light. If you go to India or, in some of the other developing countries, you will see no lines on the road because you can expect animals, trucks, cars, auto rickshaws, sometimes they're even running on the sidewalk and there's animals. But people thrive well in that kind of an unstructured environment. So if you're dealing with people who come from that country, you can throw them in a crisis situation and they'll be able to come out of it. Whereas we are so structured, we work with contracts. India, it's more about the rule of the word, there is an understanding. So that's what I mean by structure.
Mala, in your classes, you cover extensively on how to bridge the gap. Can you give us a brief overview?
First and foremost, the first lesson I teach people is to put yourself in the other person's shoes. Don't you all agree? That when you put yourself in the other person's shoes, definitely there is going to be more of an understanding and a better interaction. So I have the 7 golden rules to close the gap. Don't assume, don't make assumptions. Understand the roots behind which these behaviors are visible to you. So that's number 1. And then don't stereotype. Because when you stereotype a person, you know what happens? Then you will understand or you'll excuse their behavior, tolerate their behavior, or basically ignore them and ignore their shortcomings. And you don't want to do that. For instance, if you think that people from another country, don't function well with contracts and deadlines and schedules and timing, and say, okay, that's the way they are, we'll work around them, then you are basically spending a lot of time, wasting your time. So it's better to understand, to educate them, and to make sure that they practice till they perfect it. So communications is a two-way street. So you need to make sure that your expectations of the other person are laid out very clearly and they react and respond to you likewise. The other thing that I would strongly recommend is don't go looking for differences. There are a lot of commonalities, people from different countries, for them, the sincerity about meeting the goals, revenue is important, the profit is important. They do care about people. They love people. They want to interact with people. So those are all commonalities, and look for that. When you do, then the communication flourishes. My fourth rule is don't ridicule people. I have to give you this example. We were at lunch with a few friends, and there were two newcomers, and they looked at me and they said, Mala, you're from another country, but your English is so good. And I was very proud. I looked at them and I said, I went to a convent. And they started laughing. And the laughter was so loud, and I was so embarrassed. But a friend of mine, a kind friend of mine who knew where I was coming from and understand the background, said, oh, I would like to add, I think we laughed before Mala explained herself. She comes from, a private school in India run by Christian missionaries. And that's why her English is so perfect. Don't you guys agree? So ridiculing somebody basically shuts them off, and that's not the way to foster communications. And the other thing is, when you make a mistake in cultural communications, don't try to cover up or make the other person feel bad. It's best to face it, confront it, and apologize for that, and learn from them how to interact better the next time. And the other thing is to do your research. Show that you care about the person. I'll give you an example. I had somebody by the name of Eileen reporting to me, and she later on moved to another organization and became the director of business development for a nursing agency. And she would call on a lot of Asian Indian doctors. And Eileen one day called me and she said, Mala, this is Christmas time and I normally take gifts for my customers. What can I take for these Indian doctors? They're really lovely. And I told Eileen, that's mistake number one. I was so close to her, so I could laugh at her. I said, don't think about gifts for Christmas. Think about what festivals those Indian doctors celebrate. And I explained to her the major festival. It's called the Festival of Lights. And I said, why don't you focus on the Festival of Lights? And here, this is a store that you can go and you can get a lot of nice savories, and you can get those, package them, and in fact the store would package them for you, and you can give that as gift. And that was such a hit. All the doctors, the staff were just shocked that somebody would, an Irish woman would think about their festival and give them gifts. So that was really a hit. So show that you care, and that really pays off. Finally, be very open-minded. Don't be close-minded. Don't, all the rules, number 6, if you observe them, then you will be open-minded. So these are the 7 golden rules that I teach, but I elaborate on them. We have class exercises, case studies, teamwork, which I use to demonstrate these behaviors.